In modern times, the word Thanksgiving instantly conjures images of turkey, family gatherings, gratitude, and the origin story taught in elementary schools. Pilgrims and Native Americans sitting down together in harmony. But the truth is that the 1621 event in Plymouth was never called Thanksgiving by those who were there. In fact, the people who participated in that gathering, the English settlers we call Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people, would not have even recognized the modern holiday that bears the name. To understand why, we have to look at how the word Thanksgiving was understood in the 17th century. For the Puritans and separatists like the Pilgrims, a Thanksgiving was a solemn religious day, usually marked by prayer, fasting, and church services. These events were proclaimed by religious leaders in response to specific events, such as military victories, good harvests, or deliverance from hardship, and they were deeply spiritual, often held in a church, not around a feast table. The 1621 harvest celebration in Plymouth, while certainly a time of joy and gratitude, was not observed in this manner and does not align with what the Pilgrims themselves would have considered a true Thanksgiving. The event that took place in the autumn of 1621 was, by all evidence, a traditional harvest feast, a common European practice that marked the end of the agricultural season. The Pilgrims had just survived their first brutal winter in the New World, during which nearly half their number had died from disease, starvation, and exposure. With the help of the Wampanoag, they had managed to plant and harvest enough food to see them through the next winter. This successful harvest was something to celebrate, and they did so with a multi-day feast that included games, shooting contests, and communal eating. Contemporary accounts of the event, such as those written by Edward Winslow and William Bradford, do not refer to the celebration as Thanksgiving. Winslow described it as a harvest celebration, and nowhere in the surviving texts is there a suggestion that the gathering was intended to be a religious day of thanks in the traditional sense. More importantly, the idea of a shared national holiday didn't exist at the time. The colonies were small, scattered, and largely independent from one another, and holidays were local affairs, often dictated by clergy or governors. It wasn't until much later, more than 2 centuries, that the 1621 harvest celebration began to be retroactively labeled as the first Thanksgiving. This reinterpretation came largely in the 19th century, as Americans sought to create unifying national myths in the wake of the Civil War. The idea of Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a peaceful meal became a convenient symbol of unity, cooperation, and the founding of a nation. It was a romanticized story, shaped more by cultural desire than historical accuracy. Thus, the event in 1621 was never considered a Thanksgiving by those who lived it. The name was applied much later, reshaped to fit a narrative that suited a different time. Understanding this distinction helps us better appreciate the complexity of early colonial history and the realities faced by both settlers and indigenous peoples during that time. The 1621 gathering that took place in Plymouth was, at its core, a harvest celebration, a moment of relief and rejoicing after a season of intense hardship and survival. To understand the true nature of this event, it's important to remove the layers of myth that have developed over centuries and return to what the historical record actually tells us. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth in 1620 faced a brutal first winter, during which disease and exposure killed nearly half of the original settlers. By the time spring arrived, only around 50 of the original 102 Mayflower passengers were still alive. It was not until they received crucial help from the Wampanoag people, including Squanto, who taught them how to plant corn and fish the local waters, that the possibility of survival began to take root. By the fall of 1621, the settlers had successfully grown enough food to last the coming winter. This moment represented more than just agricultural success. It was a turning point that suggested their presence in the New World might be sustainable. To mark this achievement, they did what people across Europe often did after harvest time. They celebrated. There was food, fellowship, and festivity. According to Edward Winslow's letter, written in December 1621, the celebration lasted for 3 days and included feasting, recreational activities, and the participation of Massasoit and around 90 Wampanoag men. These guests were not merely passive attendees, but arrived bearing venison and other food, contributing significantly to the feast. The Harvest Festival was a traditional part of English rural life. After the harvest had been safely gathered, communities in England would often hold celebrations with food, games, and sometimes even communal drinking. It was a social event as much as an agricultural one, and the Plymouth colonists were continuing a custom they had grown up with in the Old World. However, what made this occasion unique was the presence of the Wampanoag, whose attendance was rooted more in diplomacy than holiday spirit. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had a fragile peace treaty, formed out of mutual necessity. The Wampanoag had suffered devastating losses from European-borne diseases before the arrival of the Pilgrims, and Massasoit saw an alliance with the English as a means of strengthening his position against rival tribes. The Harvest Feast was a public display of that alliance, a moment where diplomacy and survival intersected with celebration. The feast likely featured a mix of foods that were native to the region and what the English were able to cultivate. This included corn, squash, beans, wildfowl such as ducks and geese, venison provided by the Wampanoag, and possibly seafood like mussels and eels. There were no pumpkin pies, no mashed potatoes, and no cranberry sauce as we know it today. The food was prepared using methods the Pilgrims had adapted from both their European backgrounds and what they had learned from their indigenous neighbors. So, while the 1621 event is often referred to today as the first Thanksgiving, it was not a formal holiday of thanks in the religious sense. It was not a singular, defining national moment. It was a harvest celebration, something very human and very local, born out of relief, gratitude, and cautious hope for the future. It was a communal acknowledgement of the fact that, against overwhelming odds, they had made it through their first year. The relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people in 1621 was not a simple story of generous hosts welcoming weary newcomers. It was, rather, a strategic alliance built on mutual interests and shaped by the political realities of the time. When the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in December 1620, they landed not in an untouched wilderness, but in a region that had been devastated by disease. Over the preceding years, European-born epidemics had swept through coastal Native American communities, including the Wampanoag Confederacy, killing a large portion of the population and significantly weakening their position in the region. Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, or chief, understood that his people were vulnerable. With their numbers reduced and neighboring tribes, such as the Narragansett to the west, growing in strength, the Wampanoag were in a precarious position. The arrival of the English settlers presented both a risk and an opportunity. Although the newcomers were clearly struggling to survive and lacked knowledge of the land, they also possessed weapons, goods, and a potential for alliance that could help the Wampanoag maintain their sovereignty and resist rival tribes. The alliance was formalized in March 1621 when Massasoit and the Pilgrims agreed to a peace treaty. This agreement established mutual support and defense. If either party were attacked, the other would come to their aid. The treaty also promised that neither side would harm the other or steal from each other. While the document reflects a hopeful vision of coexistence, it was first and foremost a practical arrangement. The Wampanoag offered knowledge and aid, teaching the English how to plant corn, fish, and navigate the local environment, while the Pilgrims provided an alliance that Massasoit hoped would deter aggression from other indigenous nations. When the Wampanoag arrived at the 1621 harvest celebration, they came not as curious visitors, but as allies. Massasoit brought with him approximately 90 men and a gift of venison. Their presence at the feast was a political gesture as much as a social one. They were reinforcing their treaty, establishing a public relationship with the English, and ensuring that this new group of settlers remained aligned with their interests. The Wampanoag were experienced diplomats and had centuries of intertribal politics behind them. They recognized the power of alliance building, and their relationship with the English was no different. It's also important to understand that this alliance was built on fragile foundations. While the Pilgrims and Wampanoag cooperated for several years, the relationship was never entirely free of tension. Both groups were keenly aware of their own vulnerabilities and of the advantages the other could provide. The Pilgrims relied heavily on the Wampanoag in their early years, while the Wampanoag viewed the English as useful partners in a complex and shifting landscape of tribal power dynamics. In time, the balance of power would change dramatically. As more English settlers arrived and colonial expansion accelerated, the earlier cooperation gave way to conflict. But in 1621, during that brief moment of celebration, the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims stood together as allies, not out of simple goodwill, but out of necessity and calculated interest. Their alliance was not a mythic symbol of unity. It was a temporary, strategic partnership forged in a time of uncertainty. Despite the images of warmth, unity, and celebration that are often associated with the 1621 harvest feast in Plymouth, the reality on the ground was far more complex. Beneath the shared meals and temporary cooperation between the English settlers and the Wampanoag, people lay a quiet but persistent tension and unease. This unease was not born of malice, but rather of necessity, mistrust, and the precarious nature of the political and cultural relationship that was developing between two vastly different peoples. When the Pilgrims first arrived in North America, they were not seen as neutral newcomers. They were entering a land that was already inhabited, organized, and deeply rooted in centuries of indigenous governance and culture. The Wampanoag, like many other native peoples, had already encountered Europeans before the arrival of the Mayflower. These previous encounters often ended in violence, exploitation, or the spread of deadly disease. As a result, indigenous groups had good reason to approach any new European settlers with caution. The Pilgrims, for their part, were also on edge. Having just barely survived their first winter in the New World, they were constantly aware of how vulnerable they were. Their numbers had been severely reduced by disease and exposure. Their knowledge of the land was limited, and they had little sense of who their potential allies or enemies might be. Every move they made was calculated for survival, and this included their relationship with the Wampanoag. While they were grateful for the help and guidance the native people provided, they were also wary of being overwhelmed or betrayed. The peace treaty signed between the Pilgrims and Massasoit in the spring of 1621 was a significant step forward, but it did not eliminate underlying fears. This was a fragile peace built on mutual advantage, not deep trust. Both sides knew that any number of events, miscommunication, a broken promise, and accidental offense could lead to conflict. That awareness shaped every interaction, including the celebrated feast that would later be remembered as the first Thanksgiving. The gathering itself, which lasted 3 days, involved nearly 90 Wampanoag men and only about 50 surviving English colonists. This imbalance in numbers may have contributed to a heightened sense of caution among the settlers. While there is no record of outright hostility during the celebration, the mere scale of the native presence likely reminded the Pilgrims of their position as guests in a land that was not truly theirs. Similarly, the Wampanoag were careful to maintain a posture of cooperation, but they were undoubtedly observing the settlers closely, measuring their intentions and capabilities. Cultural differences added another layer of unease. The two groups had very different languages, customs, spiritual beliefs, and worldviews. Even simple gestures or decisions could be misinterpreted. These cultural barriers made communication difficult and created room for misunderstanding or suspicion, even during seemingly friendly encounters. While the feast may have been peaceful on the surface, it took place in a climate of mutual observation and careful diplomacy. The tensions were not immediate precursors to conflict, but they were always present. They were signs of a relationship that was still being tested, a temporary truce in a land where power and survival were always at stake. The uneasy peace of 1621 held for a time, but it foreshadowed the more tragic developments that would come in the decades ahead. In this sense, the first Thanksgiving was not a timeless moment of harmony, but a snapshot of a brief and delicate balance between caution, cooperation, and the ever-present shadow of uncertainty. When people today imagine the first Thanksgiving, the image that often comes to mind includes a golden, brown roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and perhaps a dish of mashed potatoes. These foods have become staples of the modern holiday, deeply rooted in American tradition and culture. However, the actual menu at the 1621 Harvest Feast in Plymouth would have looked quite different, both in ingredients and preparation methods. The foods shared between the English settlers and the Wampanoag people reflected what was locally available, what could be hunted or harvested, and what each group contributed to the gathering. There is no historical record confirming that turkey was served at the 1621 feast, despite its iconic status today. Wild turkeys did live in the region, and it is possible they were part of the meal, but the accounts of the feast mention only fowl in general. It is more likely that ducks, geese, and possibly swans were hunted and prepared. These birds were plentiful in the area and could be caught in large numbers, especially during the fall migration season. The Wampanoag also brought 5 deer, which means venison played a significant role in the meal and may have been one of the main sources of protein. Seafood was another likely component, given the settlers' proximity to the coast and the abundance of marine life in the region. The Pilgrims had learned from the Wampanoag how to gather shellfish and fish using weirs. Mussels, clams, eels, and perhaps lobsters could have been included in the feast. These were familiar and reliable food sources for the local tribes, and were probably introduced to the English settlers during their first year of survival. Corn, a staple of the indigenous diet, certainly made an appearance at the table, but not in the form of cornbread or sweet corn as it is known today. The Wampanoag grew a type of flint corn that was dried and ground into a coarse meal. This could be used to make corn porridge or mush, likely cooked in clay pots and flavored with nuts, seeds, or berries. Cornbread as we know it, baked with flour and leavening agents, would have been unlikely in 1621 due to limited baking equipment and ingredients. Fruits and vegetables were available in abundance, although they would have been seasonal and gathered from the surrounding environment rather than cultivated in gardens. The menu might have included onions, beans, squash, pumpkins, and possibly Jerusalem artichoke. Berries, especially cranberries, were known to grow wild in New England, but there is no evidence they were turned into a sauce or sweet dish. Cranberry sauce, as we know it today, requires sugar, a luxury the Pilgrims did not have in great supply, if at all. The same can be said for desserts in general. Without wheat flour, butter, or ovens, pies and cakes were simply not possible. Instead of heavily seasoned dishes, most of the food was likely boiled, roasted, or cooked over open fires, using techniques shared by the Wampanoag or adapted by the Pilgrims from their English traditions. Meals would have been hearty and practical, with a focus on sustenance rather than indulgence. The foods present at the feast were a reflection of survival improvisation, and cooperation between two very different cultures trying to make the most of their shared environment. Understanding the real menu of the 1006-121 celebration brings us closer to the truth of that moment in history, one that was grounded in necessity, not nostalgia. The popular belief that the 1006-121 gathering at Plymouth was the first Thanksgiving in America overlooks a much longer and more complex history of Thanksgiving observances that took place well before the Pilgrims ever set foot on the shores of New England. The idea of giving thanks, both as a spiritual act and a communal celebration, was not invented by the English settlers and certainly not unique to them. In fact, ceremonies of gratitude and harvest festivals were already long-standing traditions among indigenous peoples across the continent. These ceremonies were deeply rooted in the cycles of nature, agricultural success, and spiritual life, and they occurred seasonally in many native cultures long before any Europeans arrived. Furthermore, even among European colonists, the notion of a Thanksgiving had already been practiced in the Americas. One of the earliest recorded Thanksgiving ceremonies held by Europeans on what would become U.S. soil occurred in 1565 when Spanish settlers led by Pedro Menendez de Avalos landed in what is now St. Augustine, Florida. After arriving safely, they held a mass of Thanksgiving and shared a meal with the local Timucua people. This event took place more than 50 years before the Pilgrims' arrival in Plymouth. Another earlier Thanksgiving was held in 1610 in Jamestown, Virginia. The settlers there had also suffered terrible hardships and starvation. When supply ships finally arrived with provisions, the grateful colonists held a religious day of thanks. Additionally, in 1619, a group of English settlers at Berkeley Hundred near Jamestown held a formal Thanksgiving observance upon arriving, as directed by the terms of their charter. They gave thanks to God for their safe voyage, and the document they carried instructed them to observe that day annually as one of Thanksgiving. These earlier events challenged the idea that the 1006-121 feast was the first Thanksgiving, though it remains the most remembered and mythologized. What made the 1006-121 celebration different was not that it was the first of its kind, but rather that it was later selected, romanticized, and embedded into the American national story, particularly during the 19th century, when the country was seeking unifying myths during and after the Civil War. Writers, artists, and educators turned to the Pilgrims as symbols of faith, perseverance, and democratic values, and the feast they held with the Wampanoag people became a convenient tale of cooperation and origin. The transformation of the 1006-121 harvest feast into the first Thanksgiving was a process of historical selection and reinterpretation, not a reflection of its unique importance at the time it occurred. For the people who participated in it, it was a local event, important, yes, but neither named Thanksgiving nor recognized as foundational. Over time, it became elevated to a place of symbolic prominence, often at the expense of other historical facts and perspectives. By acknowledging the earlier Thanksgiving ceremonies and the indigenous traditions of gratitude that predate European arrival, we gain a fuller, more honest understanding of history. It reminds us that the act of giving thanks is a universal human impulse, not the invention of one group or one moment. Recognizing that the 1006-121 feast was not the first Thanksgiving allows us to broaden our perspective and appreciate the rich diversity of experiences that have shaped the American story. The image of Thanksgiving as a national holiday, complete with turkey, family gatherings, parades, and a spirit of gratitude, is often retroactively connected to the 1006-121 feast in Plymouth, but the holiday we know today was actually shaped and formalized much later, largely in the 19th century. While the 1006-121 harvest celebration was real, it was not referred to as Thanksgiving at the time, nor was it repeated annually by the Pilgrims. The transformation of that localized event into a cornerstone of American tradition is the result of cultural, political, and social forces that emerged much later in the country's history. During the early colonial period, days of Thanksgiving were indeed declared, but they were typically solemn religious observances rather than festive meals. These days were often called by local governors or religious leaders in response to specific events, such as military victories, the end of droughts, or good harvests. There was no unified, recurring holiday observed by all the colonies, and these Thanksgiving events varied widely in their tone and purpose. It wasn't until the 1800s that the idea of an annual National Thanksgiving Day began to take hold, thanks in large part to the tireless efforts of one woman, Sarah Josepha Hale. Hale, an influential editor and writer, best known today for penning the nursery rhyme, "Mary Had a Little Lamb," was a powerful advocate for establishing Thanksgiving as a national holiday. Beginning in the 1840s, she campaigned for decades, writing to presidents, governors, and the public in an effort to unify the nation around a shared day of gratitude and reflection. For Hale, Thanksgiving was not only about honoring the past, but also about fostering a sense of moral purpose and national identity, especially as the country was increasingly divided over issues like slavery and states' rights. Her campaign finally succeeded during one of the darkest times in American history. In 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation declaring the last Thursday of November as a national day of Thanksgiving. Lincoln's goal was to use the holiday to promote unity and healing in a fractured nation. He called on Americans to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. This proclamation marked the official beginning of Thanksgiving as a recurring national observance. Even after Lincoln's declaration, the holiday continued to evolve. Over time, Thanksgiving became more secular and festive, with traditions like feasting, football games, and the iconic Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade emerging in the 20th century. The historical narrative surrounding the Pilgrims and Native Americans was further shaped and simplified through school textbooks, popular media, and national discourse, often glossing over the complex realities of colonialism and indigenous displacement in favor of a feel-good story of peaceful beginnings. It wasn't until 1941, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, that Congress officially established Thanksgiving as a federal holiday, fixing the date as the fourth Thursday in November. By then, the holiday had become firmly embedded in American culture. While it may draw inspiration from the 1621 feast, the modern version of Thanksgiving is very much a product of the 19th century and the political and cultural forces of that era. Understanding this evolution helps place the holiday in its proper historical context, not as a direct continuation of a Pilgrim tradition, but as a later invention that sought to unify and define a growing, changing nation.